For Nazi Germany, 1941 was a total disaster. They'd invaded the Soviet Union in June, thinking they could beat the Red Army in just 6 weeks. "We only have to kick in the door," Adolf Hitler said, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." But he couldn't have been more wrong. By December, German forces were stopped right at the gates of Moscow, and then thrown back by the Soviet winter counterattack. And their problems were even bigger than that. Germany used to get supplies of raw materials from the Soviets themselves, but now that they were at war, those supplies were running out. But the worst news of all came in December 1941, when the United States entered the war on the side of the Allies. More than anything, Hitler feared a war on two fronts, especially against the industrial might of the United States. His window to win the war was closing, and it was closing fast. To beat the US and its massive advantage in supplies, Hitler had to finish off the Soviet Union, and quickly. Germany's endless need for raw materials was a main reason for the campaign in the East. They needed food, metals, and most of all, oil. But Germany didn't have nearly enough. For Hitler, the huge oil fields of the Southern Caucasus were the only key to victory. Without them, the war couldn't be won. The campaign to take that oil would lead to the bloodiest battle of the Second World War, the Battle of Stalingrad. But even though many people see it as the turning point of the entire war, the battle's outcome may have been decided long before the Germans even reached the city. To find out why, we need to go all the way back to when the plan was first created. The German army that invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 was enormous, the biggest invading army ever put together at that point. But a year later, that same army was stretched thin across a huge front line that was over 2,500 kilometers long. In the north, Army Group North's siege of Leningrad was in full swing, and in the center, Army Group Center was under constant attack by Soviet forces around the city of Rzhev. This meant that for this big offensive that was supposed to win the war, Army Group South could only pull together about 72 German divisions, or around 1 million men. The operation, which was codenamed Case Blue, was planned to happen in stages. First, Axis armies would break through Soviet lines, capture the city of Voronezh, and surround the Soviet forces in eastern Ukraine. After destroying them, Army Group South would split in two. Army Group B would rush to Astrakhan to set up a blocking line along the Don and Volga rivers, before Army Group A turned south towards the oil fields of Maikop and Grozny. Hitler believed that by capturing the farmlands of eastern Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus, Germany would have all the resources it needed to stay in the war and take the fight to the US. On top of that, by taking those resources away from his enemy, he hoped to make the Soviet war machine collapse the next year. It sounded great in theory, but the plan had a lot of flaws. The plan for Operation Blue had some major problems. Getting supplies to the front was already stretched to its absolute limit. The armies had to cover huge distances, and the Germans simply didn't have the resources to capture it all. So Hitler had to add to his own forces with armies from his allies, mainly Romanians and Italians. While there were a lot of these Allied soldiers, they were not very well equipped. For example, they didn't have the famous Flak 88 gun, like the one behind me, which the Germans used very effectively against tanks. And finally, Hitler had once again underestimated his enemy. The Soviets had over 1 million more soldiers than the Germans, and were creating new air and tank armies all the time. Making Blue a success was going to be a very difficult challenge. On June 28, 1942, Operation Blue began. The Germans were expecting a tough fight from the Soviets, but Stalin thought they would attack Moscow again, so his armies in the south were actually pretty weak. When the Germans attacked, the Red Army fell apart and ran. In just over a week, Voronezh was captured, and it really seemed like the Soviet forces in the south were finished. Phase 2 started on July 9th, ahead of schedule, as German forces pushed on toward Rostov and the bend of the Don River. Here, they had planned to surround and destroy the Soviets, but the Red Army just kept retreating, and the German trap closed on nothing. At the same time, back in Germany, Adolf Hitler was getting more and more worried about the Western Allies opening a second front. In fact, Allied forces would land on the French coast at Dieppe just a few weeks later, but right then, seeing the Red Army fall apart in front of him, it looked like there was nothing standing in the way of his ultimate goal, the oil fields. And so, on July 23, 1942, Hitler changed the plan for Operation Blue, and in doing so, he changed the course of history Both army groups were now told to go for their objectives at the same time. While Army Group A raced off towards the Caucasus, Army Group B was given a new job. Before setting up their blocking line from Astrakhan along the Don, Friedrich von Paulus's 6th Army was now supposed to take the city of Stalingrad. From there, they could stop Soviet oil shipments that were moving up the Volga River. Splitting his forces like this was risky, but Hitler was so confident he would win, he actually took units away from Army Group South and sent them to Army Group Center and North. The troops left behind to follow these new orders did not have an easy time. Because of food shortages in Germany, and it getting harder and harder to get rations to the front, the German army in the east was expected to live off the land. But since the crops and other food were either destroyed or gone, this was extremely difficult. So even after taking everything they could from the local people, there are some stories that the 6th Army was already being forced to eat their horses long before they even got to Stalingrad. Despite the problems, Army Group A kept making fast progress against only a few scattered Soviet forces. On August 10th, they reached the oil fields at Maikop, but they found that Soviet engineers had already destroyed the wells. It would take time to fix them. Army Group B, on the other hand, was not having such an easy time. They were slowed down by supply problems and by Soviet forces who were finally starting to get their act together. The Red Army held up von Paulus's men for 3 weeks, taking terrible casualties but also wearing down the German forces. This forced Hitler to move units from Army Group A just to speed things up. Only after they arrived was the 6th Army able to start moving forward again. After crossing the Don on August 23rd, they reached the northern suburbs of Stalingrad the next day, and there, they were in for the fight of their lives. The defense of Stalingrad was given to the 62nd Army under the command of General Vasily Chuikov. He was a veteran of the Winter War between the USSR and Finland, where his own 9th Army had suffered a humiliating defeat. So Chuikov had a point to prove with Stalin. He was determined that Stalingrad would not fall to the Germans. As the fight for the city began, a large number of Stalingrad's civilians were still there, trying to survive or dying in the ruins of their homes. The people of Stalingrad would share in the Red Army's fight. The scene was set for one of the most desperate battles of the war. The Battle of Stalingrad started with a huge bombing of the city, which turned it into rubble. This had a terrible effect on the civilians, but it didn't destroy the city's defenses, and it actually caused more problems than it solved. The ruined buildings and rubble-filled streets made it harder for the Germans to advance, while it actually helped the Soviets. Stalingrad was the Germans' first real taste of fighting in a city, and it was a very different experience from the fast-moving blitzkrieg that had brought them this far. The Red Army proved that it was much better at this kind of city fighting. Red Army snipers even competed with each other to kill as many German soldiers as they could. But maybe even more than the number of lives lost, the biggest effect of the snipers was the fear they created among the German troops, which made them unwilling to move out in the open during the day. By the end of September, the city had turned into a meat grinder and a huge symbol for propaganda. Hitler became obsessed with capturing the city and kept pouring more and more men into the fight. At the same time, Stalin himself was willing to accept huge losses to make sure his city did not fall. Outside of Stalingrad, the Red Army launched constant counterattacks. They didn't manage to break through, but they stretched the Axis forces thinner and thinner. Further south, Army Group A was also running into tough Soviet resistance, and with most of its planes sent to Stalingrad, the Soviet Air Force now had control of the sky. Worst of all were the supply problems, which affected all of Army Group South. There were only 3 single-track railway lines heading to Stalingrad, and they weren't even fully converted to the German track size. Even though they were running at full capacity, there was a huge line of trains waiting to get to the city. This left the 6th Army short on ammunition, food, fuel, and spare parts for its tanks and planes. Paulus was stuck. He needed more men to take the city, but he could barely supply the soldiers he already had. This was a problem the Soviets didn't have. Against all expectations, the Soviet forces got a lot of new supplies and equipment sent across the river into the city. A process that was actually made easier, not harder, by the winter freeze. This vital lifeline made sure that the 62nd Army could hold the city. Meanwhile, the Germans couldn't match these replacements and reinforcements. The Germans were at a disadvantage in other ways too. Their tanks were outnumbered and not as good as the Soviet T-34s, like this one behind me. Ours is a later model, but you can still see the special sloped armor which gave it better protection with a lower armor thickness. Hitler's own tank expert considered it to be by far the best tank they had ever faced. As winter arrived and the snow began to fall, both Army Group A and B were running out of steam. Since they couldn't capture them, the German Air Force was forced to bomb the oil fields at Grozny just to keep the Soviets from using them. Meanwhile, the 6th Army in Stalingrad was exhausted, and their units were fighting on empty. Still, by mid-November, they had captured 90% of the city, while Soviet forces were clinging on by their fingernails to thin strips of land along the Volga. For everyone, the conditions were grim. Here we have a collection of letters, photographs, and documents that belonged to Fritz Ludowitz, one of the German soldiers fighting in Stalingrad. Like many Germans in their underground hiding spots, he describes how they celebrated Christmas as best they could, singing the traditional songs and writing to their loved ones in the hope that the next Christmas might be a better one. In a makeshift ceremony under the ruins, Fritz married his fiancée from a distance, probably thinking that he might never see her again. He was in fact later reported as missing, and believed to be dead. By this point, it was clear that Operation Blue had all but failed. The oil fields were either destroyed or in Soviet hands. Axis supply lines were at a breaking point, and their forces were stretched too thin on a front more than 4,000 kilometers long. Worse, the Soviet forces that Hitler thought he had defeated were still on the battlefield. They had been growing in strength this whole time, and were now ready to launch a huge attack to take advantage of the weak Axis position, Operation Uranus. On the 19th and 20th of November, 2 huge Soviet forces swung out from the north and east of Stalingrad. It was a force of over 1 million men, 1,500 planes and 800 tanks going up against the thinly spread and poorly equipped Axis allied forces. Though the Romanian troops fought bravely, they weren't able to stop the attack, and Soviet tanks poured in behind the Axis lines. With very few reserves to stop the flood, the German forces had to pull back, and on November 23rd, the 2 Soviet forces met at the town of Kalach. The 6th Army was now surrounded, and Hitler's gamble to win the war had become a disaster. So we have here a copy of the message that Hitler sent to his trapped forces to try and boost their morale. In these difficult hours, my thoughts and those of the entire German people are with you, the Führer assured them. Everything that lies in my power will be done to support you in your heroic struggle. But the actual help Hitler could provide was far too little and far too late. Even though they were weak, many German commanders wanted the 6th Army to try and break out of Stalingrad, but no attempt was made. Hitler was not willing to give up the city. Instead, he organized an airlift by the German Air Force to supply the surrounded men and a rescue force under General Erich von Manstein to save them. But neither had the strength or the resources to succeed. When Soviet forces attacked again in what was called Operation Little Saturn and broke through the Italian lines, the rescue attempt was called off. Now Army Group A pulled back from the Caucasus, and the 6th Army was left all alone. So by the end of January 1943, the starving, frozen, and sick remains of the 6th Army had no other choice but to give up the fight. In a final, ironic twist, at the very moment he was getting ready to surrender his forces to the Soviets, Hitler promoted von Paulus to Field Marshal. When this didn't convince him to keep fighting, the Führer expected von Paulus to commit suicide, since no German field marshal had ever been captured alive before. But von Paulus refused. Although some fighting inside the city would continue for many more months, the battle for Stalingrad was over. Between August 1942 and January 1943, about 500,000 Axis soldiers were taken prisoner, wounded, or killed in and around Stalingrad. Over 200,000 were taken into Soviet prisons, but only the lucky ones, including von Paulus himself, would ever return home. Soviet losses were much higher at well over 1 million, and deaths made up about half of that number. Some 14,000 Red Army soldiers, which is about the same as 2 or 3 divisions, were deliberately killed by their own side, shot by special police units for cowardice or other un-Soviet behavior. An estimated 40,000 to 45,000 civilians were also killed inside the city during the fighting. It was the bloodiest battle of the Second World War. Stalingrad had a huge impact on the war, and all of it was bad for Hitler. It marked the highest point of his goals in the East, and after that, retreat and defeat could not be stopped. It also marked the moment the USSR came of age as a military power, ready to challenge the Western Allies for the spoils of a defeated Nazi Germany. At home, Hitler's already damaged image as a brilliant military strategist was ruined even more. Not even the propaganda genius of Joseph Goebbels could hide the catastrophe from the German people. This was a major step on the road to the July 1944 bomb plot against him. In truth, the odds were already stacked against Nazi Germany long before Operation Blue or the Battle of Stalingrad took place. The plan was a risky one, and they had neither the soldiers nor the supplies to pull it off. And meanwhile, their Soviet opponents, who were always growing in strength despite huge sacrifices, were able to take advantage of the German situation. The entire campaign was another gamble of the kind that Hitler had gotten used to winning early in the war, but was now losing again and again at great cost. At the same time, Germany's luck in other places was also taking deadly hits. Axis forces were crushed at El Alamein, and major Allied landings in French North Africa set the stage for the collapse of Hitler's Italian ally. Germany's war was now a defensive one, getting more and more desperate, with only one likely outcome: